this Showtime ad at the bottom of Time.is has a really great picture of John Adams, who's played by John who's plays John Adams?
Belushi. John Belushi.
If you keep saying it, I'm gonna believe it. Stop.
It's Jim Belushi. I was trying to trick you. It's actually according to Jim Belushi.
That's not according to Jim though?
Yes, it is.
Oh, fuck out of here! You're right.
According
who's
to Jim,
John Adams?
Is John Belushi's brother, Jim Belushi.
Paul Giamatti. I genuinely, if I didn't look it up, I would have never gotten it.
I was sticking with the bit because I couldn't remember his name.
Yeah, Paul Giamatti. Hello and welcome to Chats, a television podcast, Season 8B, RootsChatz. My name is Alan, and I'm joined, as always, by Magellan.
Hey.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the show, Magellan. Thank you for joining us. Take a seat. Here's a water. Would you like a snack?
Sure.
I feel like I would abuse craft services so much if I was on like the set of a show for something. Like, what kind of snacks do you got? Because they always sound like they got the best snacks, dude. They got donuts, and then they're like, well, everyone gets fat because they all you eat is donuts all day, which is absurd. And then you have to have the one actor who's like, I'm on a diet. I can't eat anything right now. I only eat kale and I don't know what people on diets eat besides kale. What's the thingy? The root, not kale. It's gone. I don't feel like thinking about it right now.
I wish I could help you.
I can see it in my mind's eye.
Give me a description. Let's see if
it's like a wheat. There. It's like a grain sort of.
It's a root. You can make it a grain.
No, it's like a grain. You can eat it as part of a salad. It's not kale.
Quinoa.
You did it. You're so smart. Good job. The history of quinoa also very fascinating. If you've ever like read about quinoa and how it's been kind of co-opted as what was like formerly like gross, bad, unhealthy foreign food to like trendy, healthy food. Don't you just love American culture, Magellan?
Yeah, it's pretty great.
That's why you teach it. That's.
I don't teach American culture. I'm not like, hey, all this stuff is pretty cool.
Today we're going to talk about the disco.
Yeah.
No, Magellan's a history teacher and I'm a history preacher. Yes. All right, let's get it. We're here to talk about the 1977 miniseries Roots. Magellan and I watch TV shows 2 episodes a week, and right now we're watching Roots. So for this episode, we watched parts 3 and 4 of Roots, which were both written for television by James Lee and William Blinn. And let's get into it, man. First up, we're talking about part 3, which was directed by Marvin Chomsky and aired January 25th, 1977. Now, Magellan, can you please tell me what happens in part 3 of Roots?
In this episode, in 1776, John Reynolds sells the now adult Kunta Kinte to his brother William. Kunta tries to escape again, this time with dire consequences. He also meets his match in Belle Reynolds, the enslaved woman who cooks for the Williams family. So, Alan, what do you think of part 3 of Roots?
I think what's fascinating as we go further into Roots and we go past the sort of like Kunta Kinte-centric part of the story is I'm learning that Roots in a lot of ways is just it's a 1977 series for better and for worse, both in the way that it uses its cast to sort of like make the viewer feel comfortable and warm and friendly, and also that it's a story that like it's really complicated because it's not that it doesn't pull punches. It definitely like is showing things that are horrific and important to show. But like as we discussed last week, one of the sort of like critical failings of Roots that people understand is that this is like a series about suffering and about hardship and tragedy. And in episode 3, and especially in episode 4, we start seeing a version of this story that is less about the suffering and more about how the suffering breeds a sort of like familial culture, and how Black American culture is beginning to form within like groups of slaves. Like at this point, we're starting to look like a traditional family sitcom. We have Kunta Kinte and his wife. Like by the end of this episode, they have a house on the plantation, or they have a room basically on the plantation, and it starts to resemble, like I said, these sort of like familial frameworks that we're used to dealing with in television, even though we are still absolutely in the context of chattel slavery. And it feels like it's kind of starting to like kind of cover our eyes from the more horrible aspects of it, because now we have a family, and now it's about growing up and teaching your kids. I'm curious what you thought, though, because I know part 3 we still are following an adult Kunta Kinte and his whole situation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, parts 3 and 4 both deal with, if the first 2 episodes were kind of about like, you know, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be brave? What does it mean to be free? Those sorts of things. And the second episode was really all about the relationship between Kunta Kinte and Fiddler, and sort of different opinions about whether it, you know, what's worth holding on to, and what's worth fighting for, and, you know, what punishment is worth suffering. These 2 episodes kind of felt like they were riffing on that, but now bringing in the theme of love and partnership, and what's the shape that those things take, like you said, within the context of slavery. And I was torn about these episodes because I also had the feeling that they kind of at times were sitcom-y in a way that I thought was problematic, and sort of gave a lightness to this experience that I don't think is appropriate. So I don't know, but then also we do get exposed to a wide range of ways that slavery, and that the white people who enact slavery just fuck everything up, and how that cruelty kind of reaches its hands into every part of an enslaved person's life. Every joy that we see is tainted in some way, or ruined, or disrupted, or and so for those reasons, I think that ultimately these episodes are powerful and have some pretty powerful moments, but they also have moments where it's easy to kind of settle into an almost jovial tone that it's hard for me to tell if that is intentional, you know, because we do see some characters who kind of fall into the sort of, oh, it's fine attitude.
We have families and houses
people.
And money and property. Like, this is all we want, right?
Yeah, so I don't know if they're intentionally trying to like sort of lull you into a certain feeling of comfort and then take it away, or if, like we were talking about last episode, there's this kind of attempt to like assuage viewers and say like, oh, actually it wasn't that bad. You know, I think it's really tough to get a sense for where this sits. And so in different moments I was on board and I was frustrated by this one and episode 4.
Yeah. And I'm really curious, like, what the extent of that is, like how comfortable the series gets, because now that we are, at least as of the end of episode 4, like Kunta Kinte is no longer alive. There's no more like basis in that heart-wrenching, incredibly dark story that we watched LeVar Burton go through, like watched the young Kunta Kinte go through. And now we're in a different like generation, and how his suffering, but his strength passed on is beautiful and true. But I feel like I mentioned this in our first episode discussion, but it's difficult but important to remember that Roots is a story about the family and the generational like aspect of the family as more so than it is about slavery or even where this all started. Because it's about like I know for a fact that like the book at least ends with Alex Haley and him being like, the one thing I want people to get from this work is go back to your roots, look up and talk to your elders, ask them where they came from, ask them where their family came from, and see how far back you can go, because there's value in seeing how history repeats itself over and over and over again. Because now that we've seen Kunta Kinte go through so much hardship and try to escape so many times, watching him sort of become not comfortable, but be basically forced to like settle down is heartbreaking, because we've seen where he's come from, and we saw in detail what he was ripped away from and what he still thinks about in his heart of hearts. It's also cool too how, and I think "cool" is the right word here, but like the way that we're seeing a society that like is built on the backs of enslaved people, how that has evolved and changed, because people still use the same terms. People, a lot like their new owner, John Reynolds' brother William, is kind of framed early on as the sort of lie that we've even like watching this series we've been given so many times now, which is there are nice slave owners, and it's like that lie is what's used to control them even more. And that stuff is really, really dark and heartbreaking in a way that's different than anything we saw from the first two episodes. Like just watching the different generations try to sell this myth over and over again, and how it fails, and why they keep kind of falling prey to it.
Yeah, I think the really, really hard needle to thread here when you're a storyteller and you're telling the story of slavery is they have given us in the character of William Reynolds a man who is deeply cruel and brutal without ever raising a whip, right?
Right. There's actually way less overall whipping in these episodes now, because it's something used more as a like severe punishment than it is as a default, but that doesn't mean that there's less abuse, physical or otherwise, happening.
Yeah, I mean, we see he sort of, and we're jumping to talking about the white people, which maybe is a problem, but I think that it's his character encapsulates kind of the issue that I had with these episodes. You know, we see white characters who like he has a code for himself. He has rules, and he says in the second half, he's like, as long as you don't break my rules, nothing bad happens to you. Mm-hmm. And when we go to William's plantation in part 3, what Belle says of him is like, oh, he's a good master. He's always been good to me. And so, you know, I think you could walk away from this episode, and maybe not the second one as much, but you could walk away from this episode being like, okay, well, he wasn't that bad, which I think is just patently untrue. Like, mm-hmm. Anybody who holds another human being in bondage is inherently a deeply cruel person, even if they fool themselves into thinking, or don't fool themselves at all. They know what they're doing, and they're sort of giving whatever justification. But even if he's like, ooh, I don't like what those catchers did to you, that's really gross. Don't worry, I'm not that kind of person. Even with all of that, it's like, no, you're still horrible. You're still a villain who has committed a deep, deep sin. And I don't know that these episodes always accomplish communicating that to the viewer.
Yeah, right. It really does become more of a story of like, how do we fall in love with each other in this time, and like, why do we decide to have children, and what is having children and deciding to raise them say for like us finding our own freedom, and what kind of freedom does that leave us with? But to get into the main sort of meat of the episode, we are now following a Kunta Kinte in prison. To understand that it's 9 years later So that would probably put him in his mid to late 20s when we start here, at least, because he was 17 when he was brought to America. Again, if I'm understanding that correctly, that would put him at that age. And we're seeing John Amos play Kunta, which is like, John Amos at the time is in his like mid 30s. So you really just have this like big, like handsome dude just like playing a young man who still has a sort of ignorance about the world, but is
it sort of is like in Captain America when
yep,
when they have like the fake scrawny CGI body on Chris Evans and then he is Captain America on the other side. It's I don't know. I thought that was odd. I mean, John Amos is fantastic.
Yeah,
he does a great job. But
it is stunt casting though. It's not just weird age casting. It's also like for the time. It's like the guy from Good Times is the lead in our show. Like, isn't that cool? When they say like introducing John Amos, the audience at the time is like cheering in their seats. Presumably, if they've been watching that show. And it's kind of a weird counter because we've noticed is we're seeing a lot of the white characters in this show are stunt cast by like famous sitcom actors. But there are like almost all of the adult enslaved people in this are also either like actors from cinema or from sitcoms. So it's across the board. I mean, you have Scatman Crothers in episode 4. You have
as who?
The guy who teaches George who like gives him the hat.
Oh, the other cockfighting guy?
Yes, that's Scatman Crothers.
Oh, okay.
The guy who talks to Kizzy is friends with, what's his name? Not
Noah?
Sam. No, Sam.
Oh.
Is Shaft?
Oh, like, the older guy.
Yeah, that's just Shaft. And it's like Shaft like came out like a couple of years ago. Like, you guys they're doing that. And I was just to do a brief sort of side tangent about like all the actor stuff. I was like reading about all this stuff and falling down all these rabbit holes and realizing that like the 70s kind of, they had like a really unfortunately small pool of actors that were in everything. And like they're all a lot of them are in Roots, not all of them, but a lot of them are just in Roots. Between John Amos and like Crothers and just a lot of the women too.
It's so distracting.
It is. It must have been more distracting at the time.
If you'd seen it in the 70s, yeah.
Because you're like, wait, that's the guy from the All in the Family spinoff, which is like the biggest show in the universe. Like,
yeah,
really strange choice. But I mean, again, like you're saying,
I mean, John Amos does a really good job. But I also just had grown attached to seeing LeVar Burton in the role.
Yeah.
And they age Kizzy up between parts 3 and 4 by like 18 years. So it's like you could have done that with LeVar Burton and kept him as Kunta Kinte and put some old age makeup on him, because they do that with everybody else. They do that with John Amos too.
Yeah.
To make him like an old guy. So I don't know, but
maybe they weren't able to get him for too long because he had other obligations or something, or they wanted LeVar Burton, or they had the Hollywood.
I mean, this was LeVar Burton's like one of his breakout things.
Well, then yeah, maybe it's one of those things where they're like, "You're new to this. We're not going to get you on for 7." You know.
I mean, I think they did. They wanted to have the name,
yes,
and maybe you just couldn't. You can't cast John Amos as like a 17-year-old because that's definitely not believable.
Yeah.
But
dude is jacked and very tall. Like
yeah. After like 5-10 minutes, I was like, all right, I'm in it.
I can believe this is the same person. Sure.
Yeah. It's just whenever there's like a recast in any context, it's always distracting.
Yeah.
But he was really good.
Yeah. He like what I love, especially early on here, is he's still talking and spending a lot of time with Fiddler, and in front of the white people, at least, he like his English has gotten to such that he knows all the words. He knows how to call them master and how to like speak in a polite way that doesn't get him into any trouble. But he also like is putting that on, and when he's in private with Fiddler, we know that he's like, I'm doing this to be safe. Like I haven't lost that like spirit of our like history that you instilled in me, Fiddler, which is great to see. Like they are just so wonderful together. Again, speaking of like great casting, I did not even catch this last week, but Fiddler is played by Louis Gossett Jr., who, like John Amos, is still alive today, and actually was just in 2020's Watchmen as like one of the most important characters in the series. He's the father of the protagonist. Like,
oh wow,
and he's so central to the story about again, generational racial violence. And it's like the guy, a lot of the black actors on this series are not only still acting, but are still like fighting for civil rights and for equal everything across the board in Hollywood, in society. And it's really just wonderful that like they're still doing that stuff. But yeah, just that's enough of my like. I looked at Wikipedia for like a whole straight hour last night.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about. I think this first scene between Kunta Kinte and Fiddler was one of my favorite of the two episodes that we watched. It's hard to pick. There are a lot of really good scenes, but they're sort of refreshing us on the philosophical difference that Fiddler and Kunta Kinte have about freedom and like whether or not it's possible. And they have this exchange. And I was noticing this. Fiddler says there ain't no way to beat the law. And this idea of like the law and what's legal keeps coming up over and over again across parts 3 and 4. Because there's also a moment in the second one where what's her name? Missy Ann.
Missy Ann says the law. That's the thing that's right.
Yeah, right. She's like, oh, legal. She's teaching Kizzy the word legal. And she's like, oh, yeah, that's just what makes things the way they are. Like, you know, black people are enslaved and white people are, you know, naturally born smarter than them. So the law is made so that this is how things go. And I thought it was really interesting the way that the law is depicted in these two episodes as like the thing that enforces slavery, which is what's historically accurate. And what I think maybe is something that's lost and we're rediscovering in the zeitgeist as like a function of the law, that the law and justice are not the same thing, right?
Yes.
And so introducing that theme here in this conversation, I thought was well done. And it was so moving when Fiddler's starting to say like, this is the law, you know, you can't beat it. And then Kunta Kinte starts naming off all the different punishments that an enslaved person could receive for various different actions they might take. And he ends by saying, I know the law, Fiddler. I know the law too well. And that was the first moment where I was like, holy shit.
The show's going for it a little bit.
This show's going for it. And John Amos is really, really selling it. I mean, he goes in that scene from like laughing his ass off about how funny he was by like messing with the white people to going to this place of anger and pain and frustration. And it was so moving. And then Fiddler's like, you're not going to, if you run away, like you're not going to be free, you're going to be dead. And then Kunta's like, okay, well then I'm going to be free. And also this idea that keeps recurring across the two episodes, especially in the first one about, you know, death and freedom, and is death a form of freedom in this system where it seems like every other form of freedom is like tainted in some way.
It's compromised, is tainted, is
yeah.
Right, and not tenable.
So that scene really blew me away.
Yeah, there's important themes happening in that and their ideas they're talking about that not only come back but are important for the viewer both in the 1970s and now, to understand that like these are all very much contemporary questions. Like, are the idea of like rest in power, you know, it's a common phrase used now in the discussion about police brutality when people die. That like more appropriate, or as discussed, the more appropriate phrasing is, instead of saying rest in peace, is to say rest in power, because like you're not done. You escaped, but you're not done fighting, even though you were killed. So like it's really great that like even this is like the key success of Roots, is that its message, for better and for worse, honestly, hold extremely true today. There ain't no way to beat the law. White folks live by it, and N-words die by it. Like that's just you could you could say that today 100%.
Yeah, right.
um
And then the following the trajectory of that scene, the place that it ends is, I think what I love the most about the Fiddler Kunta Kinte relationship is that Fiddler will fight like hell in these moments with Kunta Kinte to be like, don't run, it's foolish, you're going to get yourself hurt. The last time you ran away, I had to sleep in the barn all winter, like all these things. And then when Kunta Kinte sticks to that and is resolute in wanting to run, Fiddler's like, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do to help you get away.
yeah.
Because at the end of the day, even though Fiddler is like, come on, all these things, what's the most important to him is freedom and making sure that his friend is able to escape. So he says, like, I'm going to go play the fiddle and distract everyone with my music so they won't see it when you jump in the back of the last wagon that's leaving the plantation today. And so Kunta Kinte runs.
Up until this point,
escape.
Fiddler has never played such an incredible hoedown performance as he does in the scene. It's so good.
They do a pretty good job. And Lou Gossett Jr. does a good job too here of not giving away the fact that he's not the one playing the
Yep. I thought the same exact thing.
It's like right up until the scene where he dies, I couldn't catch a moment where it was clear that he wasn't doing the notes. So I was like, okay, that was pretty good. Because he at least like he knows generally the shape of the tune, and that's more than you can say for most actors who like fake playing an instrument on screen.
Totally.
Like someone's behind the piano and it's like, you're not playing.
You're not touching that.
Yeah.
But yeah, he attempts to escape once again, and worth mentioning here that we get a brief moment with John Reynolds earlier where now that he's older, and he's been doing this for so long, he's getting a little like comfortable and has been drinking a lot. And I found it kind of weird and maybe a little bit, it's worth talking about, how a lot of the slave owners grow up to become alcoholics in this series. I mean, it kind of makes it seem like, it's the only thing that like lets me stop caring, and I have to. And like the way that in the first episode, what was his name? What was the name of the guy who ran the ship? I can't even remember.
Yeah, Captain Davies.
Yeah, Captain Davies was like, I'm drinking a lot to not think about this. And it's like,
right.
In reality, like a lot of this is it's not coming from like ignoring it and closing your eyes and drinking away the thoughts. It's more like you are actually very clear-headed and deliberately choosing to say things like that. But the show knows that a little bit, and once he's like sobered up a little bit is when Reynolds is like, no hesitation, I want Kunta Kinte brought back dead, if you have to. Like he's my property, but like he's caused me more problems than he's worth anymore, literally. So, they kind of have their cake and eat it too in that way. But I thought that was interesting because I've seen that now a couple times.
Yeah, I think they are putting in the effort to show that, and it's to the point of what Captain Davies said in part 2, where he's like, do you ever think that we're as much enslaved as the people who are in the hold of the ship? That the white people we see are not deserving of our sympathy, no. I don't think.
No. But
what we're seeing is that they are as much compromised by the institution of slavery as the things that they do compromise the joys and the freedoms that are possible for the people that they enslave. And something that really you kind of arrive at the end of these 2 episodes is this question about where's the soul in all of this? And by enslaving people, all of the white characters that we meet are choosing to corrupt their souls, and we see that play out in the way that they behave, in the way that it takes a physical toll on them as they age, all of those things.
Right, they can't escape the sort of like fundamental sin that they've all committed.
Right.
So Reynolds assigns Mr. Ames to capture Kunta Kinte again, and he escapes to a barn, which turns out we find out is at the plantation where Fanta is being kept, and she's now going by the name Maggie, and another enslaved person sees Kunta in the barn and basically says, like, don't ever tell, I'm never telling anyone I saw you, but you can go wherever you want. Like, there's that nice moment of solidarity. And then we get to one of the most heartbreaking scenes of both these episodes.
So rough.
We've known that the stuff around Fanta is like some of the saddest in the series, and here we are. We think that this is a love story between these two people, but he asks her, Fanta, what did they do to you? And she says simply, everything. This is now like the third time in this episode that someone peeks at Kunta Kinte's back and acknowledges how many scars he has from being whipped repeatedly. And like he knows, like we've both suffered a lot of pain, and it's unspeakable, it's unconscionable, and especially and as a woman even, it goes a lot deeper than just being whipped, which she absolutely was repeatedly. She also had her language taken away from her. He tries to speak to her in their Gambian language, and she doesn't understand a word of it. And she says, "Don't speak that. Talk to me." And he's heartbroken because the person he knew is standing in front of him and recognizes him, but she won't even refer to him by his name. She says, "What's your name?" And he tells her, Kunta Kinte, and she's like, "No, but what's your actual name now?" And he's like, I don't like Toby. And she's like, okay, well, that's your only name. That's what I'm calling you. But they do share a moment of like actual passion and emotion. Another heartbreaking line here when I believe, which one of them says white men don't leave us?
That's, I think Kunta Kinte says that.
Yeah. Incredible. And then they end up kissing just on the floor at night because it's the only place where they can have a moment. But yeah, white men don't even leave us. Like we don't even have she says, I can't have relations with you because if the baby wasn't mixed race, then my owner would know that I was with someone else. Yeah. Which is
it's horrific.
So you can't, like, that's why it's like, okay, it's not like the awful truth of this has been dulled in episodes 3 and 4. It's just that it's taken on a different shape.
Right.
But the man still believes that he can go back. He still talks about the Mandinka and his mother and father and his younger brother, and he knows how old they would be. He's kept track of time and their names. I think that article you sent me, the BuzzFeed article, the Django Problem, the Tangled History of Roots, also mentions this, though, that like one of the really weird things about Roots, especially in this miniseries, is that it does sometimes feel like he is the only enslaved person like who remembers and acknowledges his African history.
Yeah, it's and I want to talk more about the fantasy, but this particular thread you're pulling on, I want to focus on for a second because I was thinking about this across both episodes, and I think you said this at the beginning as well, that it feels like the sort of central thesis of Roots, and the reason it's called Roots, is that the path to freedom is inextricably linked with an understanding of your heritage.
Yes.
And in the context of chattel slavery in the United States, we're talking about African American people being in touch with their African roots. And I don't know how to feel about that. I don't think that I'm at all equipped to assess whether or not that is like a accurate thesis. Because I can see on the one hand, in a scene like this with Fanta, where she's lost her language, where both of them have had new names imposed upon them, understanding your roots is a path to having a name and a language and a culture that is entirely separate from and liberated from white influence. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, it's sort of, I think, painting a simplistic picture of enslaved people who were born, people like Belle, right, who were born in America, whose parents were born in America, whose grandparents were born in America. It's painting the simplistic picture of them, and Belle is complicated later, but the initial sense that we get of her is like, oh, she's another one of these Americans who doesn't know their roots and so isn't trying to be free or doesn't yearn for freedom or is like too comfortable. And even in the second half, we see knowing your roots. It's almost like this kind of game of telephone a little bit, where Kunta Kinte can instill in his daughter Kizzy a certain, a certain set of Gambian words, and he can talk about their culture. But then by the time we meet her son, those things have kind of been lost, or he's misunderstood some of them. And so there's this tragedy of like, how close do you have to be to those roots to even be able to access them as a path to liberation,
Right, because one of the hardest things and most important things that I think Haley is trying to get across in like the original telling of this story is, again, that you have to make the effort yourself, because history is not going to let you, especially when so much of your history has been erased. It's not going to let you just have access to the like myths and cultural understanding that your ancestors had. You have to seek that out yourself, because somebody like George is going to grow up never knowing any of it, the Mandinka culture or language. He's just like, I was born here. My whole like generations of people have been born here. Like I have no reason to know that stuff, even though he has the understanding of freedom.
And this is all further complicated by a few things. I mean, the sort of elephant in the room is that Alex Haley, like Kunta Kinte might not have been a real person also.
Yeah, it's the searching I did basically confirmed that everybody that we've seen in these first 4 episodes is unlikely to have existed as they did. Like up to, I think and go on to call him Chicken George. That's like the name that he takes on. Him backwards is all questionable. Everyone after him, we have like historical records of at least their names being accurate, but it's really strange that like he chose to. Yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted your point.
And then if you're an African American person in the United States and your ancestry goes back generations within the United States, it's entirely possible that like you are a descendant of many different African societies. Because I mean, we saw in part 1 when people are brought from the coast of Africa through the Middle Passage, on that ship, there's a variety of cultures and languages that are there that are being shoved together and treated as if they're one monolithic group of people.
Exactly, yeah.
And so even there, like, what roots do you attach yourself to? And I don't know. And I'm not trying to sort of like throw water on this idea of like roots are a path to freedom, because I think that there's merit to it. I'm more so trying to put myself in the shoes of like, how do you do that? There are just so many challenges in the face of that only become more difficult the further removed someone is from like the ancestor who was brought from Africa in chains to the United States.
Right. And how does that affect the story that you're trying to tell if you're somebody like Haley who, after George, it's like we have records of these people, and maybe by like 1 or 2 or 3 generations above him, we've probably met those people and we literally can see where they lived and died and all that stuff. Right. So like then how does the story get affected? So that's part of why I've been like really curious to check out after this, maybe looking at Roots: The Next Generations to see like how does less distance from the past affect the story being told. But that's neither here nor there. You wanted to continue talking about the Fantasy.
I can't remember what I wanted to say about it. What did I want? Oh, I remember. Yeah, I think there were a lot of important things that we were talking about sort of like the ways that cruelty manifests in slavery and the way that cruelty is enacted through slavery by white people that are represented in this scene. So like, again, new names being imposed upon people, the expectation that you speak English and you forget your sort of mother tongue, and then everything that Fanta's implying and talking about when it comes to rape and the ways that she is sort of her body, she's not allowed to have sex with other people or use her own body for fear of violent retribution on the part of the person who owns her, the plantation owner. I think there's also something to be said here for just like this being sadly like a moment of maturation for Kunta Kinte, because he's been holding on to this idea of Fanta now for what, almost 20 years at this point?
Yeah.
Or at least 10. And he barely knew her. I mean, he only knew her for a grand total of like at least 15 minutes that we saw on screen. And he's sort of projecting all of these ideas about freedom and about returning to Africa onto her. And it's just so sad to watch him reunite with her and realize that like he never really knew who she was.
Exactly.
He just had these ideas of like, oh, you're another person from the Gambia, you're Mandinka, so you we understand each other. But then when those things are gone, you know, it's sort of, there's nothing there in that relationship because he doesn't know her. And that, I think, part of the deep tragedy of that scene, along with all of the other things we were talking about, is that realization of like, Kunta Kinte realizes there's nobody that I knew from my old life who I can reach, who I can talk to. And he doesn't fully give up on the idea of running away in this scene, but I think this is sort of the beginning of him realizing like, my old life is not something I'll ever be able to like physically visit again. Yeah.
And yeah, my final point on that too is like him having only lived 17 years, and then if you think about like how much of your family and cultural understanding did you have at 17 years old,
right?
And for him to now pass that down and be like, that's everything, guys, the thing that I got, that like collective knowledge is all I get to pass down to my generations. It's my first 17 years. Everything after that I didn't get to experience, so it's all, you know, nostalgia to me. But we can zoom right along as we get to a lot of other big things that happen. Him and her are eventually caught in the barn, and when he's threatened, he is tied to a tree. And the slave catcher men, they threaten to they're gonna basically get their retribution, and it's that they're either going to cut off his legs so that he can't run anymore, which is again or cut off his foot, which is a common practice. Or cut off his penis so that he can't have children or have sex. He chooses his legs, and we're to presume that he's never going to be able to run again. And it's at this point that Dr. Reynolds, William Reynolds, kind of gets a lot more arrogant and cruel. And it's at this point that I go, wait a minute, that's the dad from the Brady Bunch.
Holy fuck.
And I just,
oh my God.
As soon as I realized that and was able to pull back the layers of like wig and makeup, I was like, I'm never going to stop thinking about that. And there's no way people watching this were like not thinking about that, because that's the Brady Bunch, dude. Like, he's the dad.
That's like if fucking Ty Burrell was a plantation owner or something. That is even more so like distracting.
Right, exactly. But like, sitcoms were, they like literally, I think I was reading like All in the Family had like 76% network share when it aired. Like 76% of Americans watching TV at the time were watching that show. Just really let that.
Here's a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think by casting, and I think we maybe talked about this a little bit last time with like Ed Asner and all that, but do you think that casting the dad from the Brady Bunch either A, communicates to a white audience like, hey, even these people that nowadays you think of as really likable would have been these cruel people back then, or do you think it's making people sit in front of their TVs and be like, hey, it's the dad from the Brady Bunch, I like him?
Oh God, he has a whip. I think it's unfortunately both. I think that's the beautiful grift of Roots at the time, is that you are able to like get a network to get the show on the air. It's part of the process of getting the show on TV. Is like, hey, we have all these cool
That's
actors.
interesting.
You know, like this show might not have been made with a bunch of relative unknowns.
True.
I'm sure, like if we end up going on to discuss 2016 Roots, which is a series with fewer huge name actors, like does that work better because these are all people who we don't recognize, or what?
And I guess it gets people in the door, right? Like Roots was a huge television event that was very widely viewed, and maybe people wouldn't have seen the other scenes of cruelty and the reality if there weren't the commercials that were like Ed Asner as Captain Davies. Blah, blah,
Yeah, because who's coming home, you know, at 7:00 after school and work or whatever, sitting with the family, and they're like, let's go watch a bunch of our ancestors brutalize and enslave a bunch of black folks. Like, isn't that like a fun like family time? No, that's like no, like it's very unlikely that people are going to want to enjoy watching that with their families. But when you tell me that, like, oh, Ed Asner is in a historical period piece, I'm like, oh, that guy from The Thing, like blah blah blah, great. The dad from the Brady Bunch is like a main character on this, cool. That's your in, like I was saying. But anyways, so Kunta Kinte wakes up and he is sort of struggling with the fundamental like reason to live now that he doesn't think he can escape anymore. And one of the women that is also owned by Dr. Reynolds, whose name is Belle, she goes by Belle Reynolds at this point, starts talking to him, and there's a really charming, touching scene here where she kind of teases him for his arrogance and his sort of cockiness about the Mandinka culture and all that, which ends up being their like core struggle later. But it's this sort of flirtatious moment where she's like, "Oh, you think you're such an incredible warrior? Like she's understanding her role not only as an enslaved person but as a woman, saying like, you can't even get up and fight me. If you're saying that you're never going to run again, then get up here and like try to get at me, basically." And he like puts the boot on and like gets on the crutches, and he comes up to her and walks, and she's giddy because she realizes she's helped perform a small miracle, and pushes him to not only get back into learning to walk, but he says, I'm gonna learn to run, which is incredible. And that was my first like kind of wanted to cry part. So there is still, you know, positivity and happiness beyond just like Kunta Kinte and Fiddler being cool friends. Is also like culture is starting to form. Love is happening amongst all this.
Yeah, and I think the Kunta Kinte Bell relationship is well rendered. I enjoy watching them together. I think in the next episode there's more of this sort of like soap opera stuff that I was not crazy about, but I think that their relationship is actually pretty good and honest.
Yeah, exactly. And it again kind of feels similar to a lot of modern relationships I've seen, where like the father figure is the one who feels more directly attached to the quote unquote old country, and the mom is like, no, we need to raise children here, we need to be here and act like this here. Even my parents in a lot of ways were like kind of like that early on and had that sort of conflict, but it's evolved since then, obviously. So basically Kunta Kinte, now that he can't do a lot of like manual legwork and field work, he becomes the driver for Mr. Reynolds, the carriage driver, which Fiddler is very happy for him. And they have this hilarious moment, like genuinely we get like a good laugh out loud part.
But what?
You told Bill you could drive, didn't you?
Yeah, I can drive.
Well, you better drive this horse pretty fast and pretty quick.
How come?
Barn door still closed.
It's it's just like, I love what Fiddler brings to this show. Even though, yeah, like you were saying earlier, the like comedy can sometimes feel like it's undercutting things just a smidge.
Yeah, my favorite Fiddler moment, joking moment, was when Kunta and Belle are talking about how the Revolutionary War is going on.
Yeah,
and he they're like, "Oh, did you hear the white people are free?" And he's like,
Finally.
"Oh man, I've been so worried, tossing in the night about whether or not these white people are going to get their freedom."
Incredible. Fantastic. You love to see it.
Really good. Yeah.
And
I thought, just to be the history teacher for a second, about the context of the Revolutionary War. I thought it was interesting that they added in that note. I think it's William Reynolds who mentions it, that the British are offering freedom for any enslaved people who choose to run away and fight with them.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, that's something that happened.
Wow.
And so I don't know the numbers on it, but it was a pretty frequent occurrence that enslaved people would join the British Army, which, stands to reason, right? Like, if you're enslaved, you have no particular attachment.
I don't care about these factions.
Yeah, you're just going to go with whoever is going to help you get away from slavery. And it reminded me of this book that I still haven't read, but I've been meaning to sort of get and read in more depth and teach part of it in my class. But there's this history book called The Counter-Revolution of 1776 that basically is trying to recontextualize the narrative of what the Revolutionary War was fought for. And it essentially makes the argument that, like, leading up to the revolution in the mid-1700s, there was an increased emphasis being placed in Parliament on the idea of abolition. And it was clear that England was moving in the direction of abolishing slavery. And I don't know when it was abolished in London and in England itself, but there were already abolitionists who were pressuring their elected officials in the 1700s about the idea of abolition. And so there's recent historical scholarship that's basically arguing that, like, one of the big reasons that, people like Thomas Jefferson, for example, or these other major planters supported the revolution is because they felt like it seems like England is on its way to abolishing slavery in all of its colonial holdings.
Let's get that.
Let's be our own country.
Yeah.
So that doesn't happen to us.
Right. Interesting.
And we can maintain slavery.
Yeah.
And so then the Revolutionary War and this idea of, like, independence is even further fraught and complicated.
Let us hold truth to these ideals that, like, for example, we can own people. It's like, wait.
Right. And it makes the United States out to be essentially similar to the Confederacy in motivations, at least in part. I mean, there are some people like Thomas Paine, for example, who I don't think Thomas Paine was pro-slavery. And so I think there are some people who genuinely are talking about natural rights, but there's also a significant faction of Americans who are joining into the revolution because they are like, if we do this, we can protect the institution of slavery and, like, enshrine it in the constitution of whatever country we end up creating.
I think, coming back to Roots for a sec, to the, like, intersection of the rest of quote unquote American history, like, crashing into this, like, localized story that we're telling, sometimes works and sometimes, like, gives me that tingle of, like, seeing the broad scope of things and that excitement from that. It also means that, like, sometimes the story in episodes 3 and 4 has taken a chance to focus on the white characters, which I really don't enjoy. Like, more than we already have seen, more than, like, the Captain Davies stuff, or different than the Captain Davies, because that was almost half of the first episode. Kunta Kinte, while taking Reynolds somewhere, is asked to stop in some woods, and he sees Reynolds with a mistress who we learn later is John Reynolds' wife. So it's his sister-in-law, and they are doing some really nasty kissing, flirting, role play, where basically, I gotta just put content warnings on every single episode of this fucking podcast, man. But she's, like, kind of saying that she wishes that she could be a slave to him, and does the, like, getting on the ground and groveling to him.
That was so fucked up.
Like,
oh my god.
Just Yeah, they
Holy shit.
even when they do show the white characters, it's not to make them likable at all. At least in this point in the series, it's to be like, yeah, they have their whole thing going on that we don't even have time to get into. It's just like, take a
Yeah.
look at that, acknowledge that the Reynolds family is probably all just full of like incest and grossness, and move on, because like that's not our problem right now. But we're seeing it.
Yeah, I was. Well, that's not incest. He's.
I know,
Yeah.
but I'm saying that there's
Yeah.
probably also it's very likely that there's also some incest stuff going on.
I really appreciated that moment in that scene because I was worried when we were seeing William and I don't remember her name, but
I don't either.
Mrs. Reynolds.
Yeah.
I was worried that when we were seeing them, it was going to be this kind of like, oh, darling, I'm
Like
so
a B
glad I
plot.
got to steal away. Yeah, something like this sort of semi-romantic thing. And I was like, what is going on? But then the fact that it was such a disgusting sexual fantasy about like, I want to be an enslaved woman and run away just so you can chase me. I was like, okay, Roots, good job making that completely disgusting in the way that it needed to be.
Right. Acknowledging that, and that probably happened a lot. That specific fantasy is probably fairly common. I mean, we saw in episode 2, like the people watching Kunta-Kinte at the auction, like licking their lips at him. Like, yeah, it's awful. It's awful all the way down in every single way possible. But we shift to a more wholesome scene where Belle Reynolds and Kunta-Kinte are now having dinner together because he offers her a gift, and she kind of has this beautiful moment. She starts crying because nobody has given her anything. She's giving him food, and he's giving her this like tool for, I think it's like grinding grain or something. And you see them falling in love and realizing that like we can still be kind to each other and empathize with each other, even though, you know, you were born here and I wasn't. We still have this shared experience and, you know, something that is ours that we took from them. I think it's actually important and under-discussed how she says I made cornbread. Do you like cornbread? And he says, I do. Because this is what I was talking about earlier with like the introduction of not only, I guess, African culture, but specifically African American culture, and the idea that we can take the stuff that we are making here and this is ours now. And how cornbread and a lot of food that they're making here has become staples of African American food culture here. And it's like, oh, you're seeing it. Yeah, the truth of it is that it's not just like we made it because it's what we used to do. It's like, no, we made it because it's what we had here. We are able to make cornbread here, and there's something powerful about that, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. She also gives him. There are two moments that I just thought were like really sweet. She gives him the socks that she made.
Yeah.
And one of them is like a half a sock. And then I thought this was, maybe this is a little crass, but I thought this was funny. When he brings her the bowl and she's like, well, where's the thing to, you know, grind? And he's like, I thought I'd bring the grinding part by your cabin tonight. And I was like, ooh.
Wow, flames. Good flirting skills.
Yeah.
Gonna be honest, my silly ass did not pick up on that. The sexual double entendre.
I don't even know if that was intentional. I want to think it was, but
for the audience at the time, maybe, yeah. Or yeah, who knows? But there's definitely something there. There's a lot of like good chemistry between the two of them. And we
they end up getting married. Yeah. And you know, I think it does a good job of portraying love and marriage as an act of resistance against slavery. Like it's not just like, oh, hey, yeah, we get to be together despite the cruelty, loving each other. And this is something that Fiddler sets up for us and talks about, where Fiddler's like, oh, you think it's strong to be alone. Like that's just being stubborn. And actually that's what white people want, is for us to be alone. And so being together in all sorts of different ways is an act of defiance and resistance. And so you have this scene where Kunta Kinte and Belle are getting married, and William Reynolds is way in the background. He looks so small.
This is not about him anymore. He takes his like daughter or whatever, and they just move away. They move to another area.
Yeah, and he's like kind of allowing it to happen in his mind, but he's he really doesn't have control over it.
Mm-hmm.
I think he wants to believe that he does, but they're sort of, defiantly doing it like in his face. Like, look, we're getting married and there's not anything that you can do about it. And there's even that moment where the woman who's officiating very pointedly says, and let's hope they never get sold away from each other. And she gives William Reynolds a look like, you motherfucker, don't mess with this. And I just thought that sort of that layer to the wedding scene was really nuanced, and I just think that's important to keep in mind, that it's not just like, oh, this is a sweet thing that they're getting married, but like marriage, love is as much an act of defiance as some of the things we talked about last time, like working slowly or running away, or what he did at the beginning of the episode, like pretending to be stupid when he's not.
Yeah.
All of these things are about like asserting their humanity in the face of a deeply inhumane system carried out by cruel people.
But we have to still recognize, they have to still recognize that this resistance is happening under a system that they haven't even they can't break out of just yet. Because when he goes away from the wedding and sits under a tree, and she says, why are you over here? Like, we have a whole wedding for us. And, I belong to you and you belong to me. She uses that language, and he says, yeah. And we both belong to Dr. Reynolds. Like, we just had a full wedding, which, like, acknowledging that the marriage sort of ritual, a lot of ways, is kind of possessive. And, like, yeah, we like love each other, and we like belong in each other's lives. And we have no control over those lives. Those lives aren't ours right now.
Yeah. Like, even though Reynolds is saying he would never sell them away from each other,
he still owns them.
He could.
And he
could certainly do that. And it was
eventually sells their daughter.
Right. And it was common that people who got married would be sold away from each other, or children would be sold away from their siblings or their parents. It just was a part of the system.
So, I mean, as we get to the end of episode 3, this is some of my favorite stuff. And again, both of these episodes where one evening while I think riding the carriage, Kunta Kinte he hears drums in the middle of the night, and he recognizes that it's like a piece of Muslim music that he's familiar with from his childhood. And he goes to the side of the river, and he sees an old man playing this Muslim music on a drum. He says, "Assalamu alaikum." The guy says back to him, "Alaikum salam." And he like hugs him and realizes, like, you're a brother. Like, we have this thing finally that's different from like, we are both enslaved people or we are both men. It's like, no, we are both Muslim. Like, we both have a spirituality and a like hometown, a home area that we share. That's so beautiful and has been completely stifled by the rest of the world, even by Belle, like, who has no understanding of this stuff. Like, it's not just the white people that are stifling this part of his culture. It's the other enslaved people who aren't familiar with it. Yeah. So it's really, really profound. And he has this like nice familial moment where they're talking, and this is where I felt like the show is kind of moralizing in a good way to us. And it's saying the important thing is that everyone else here is forgetting where we came from. We can't let that happen. We need this to live on. I need you to stay and keep playing your drum. And the guy says, I plan to go north. I'm going to go to the abolitionists. We're now talking about that idea, which comes through in this episode and the next one. And when I play the drums, I want you to go towards them and come with me. So, keep that in the back of your pocket, and we're going to help you be free this time for good. He talks about it to Belle, who's really terrified of the idea of freedom and escape because of her past and other people that she's tried to help escape. Were you able to get the full scope of her story here with like the other guy?
Belle's old family?
Yeah.
Yeah, so from what she was saying, she was married before on a different plantation, and they had 2 kids together, and then he tried to run away. He was captured, killed, and then they sold her children away from her.
Yeah. So she has every reason to be hesitant about another like freedom opportunity.
Yeah, she says to Kunta, one she says, if one more terrible thing happens in my life, Toby, I'll just die. I'll just die.
I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, plenty of horrible things continue to happen to her. So they end up having their child. We get some beautiful cinematic parallels. Kunta Kinte decides to name his daughter Kizzy, which is a term in Mandinka that means to stay put. And he debates this name with Fiddler while they sit under a tree together. And you know it's coming because earlier Fiddler is coughing and saying, I'm sick, I'm not feeling well, it's fine, don't worry about it. And as Kunta Kinte is saying, maybe I should lie about her name so that they don't think that I'm like bringing any of my culture here. I'll give her another name, but I need her to have this name. What do you think, Fiddler? As Fiddler has been playing this music, and he says at the beginning of the scene, he says, I'm finally playing music for me. I'm not playing music for the damn white man anymore.
Yeah.
You know it's coming. It's so predictable, but him dying here.
It still gutted me.
Of course.
Yeah.
And Lou Gossett Jr. just brings it because he's so exhausted. He's exhausted throughout this episode, in every way. And Kunta Kinte holds him and says, now you know how it feels to be free, Fiddler. So
yeah, he says, now you know what I'm always talking about.
Right.
Isn't free a fine way to be?
Amos, you're killing me. It's so heartbreaking and beautiful again. But as one life is, it's the other parallel being that one life ends as another one begins, and just like his father did in the first episode, Kunta Kinte raises his daughter up into the sky in the middle of the evening and says, "Look up into the stars. That's the only thing that is greater than you that you can see." But before the episode ends, the drumming man begins his signal to run. And just as Kunta Kinte starts thinking about going, Belle finds them. And he has this conversation with her that's really great where it's like, are you going to do this again? Or are you going to leave everything you have here? Do you have any of the lines from this ending?
It's...
or basically the gist of it?
Well, basically, he's like following the sound of the drums.
Mm-hmm.
And then Belle hears them too, runs after him, and then it's unclear. It seems like maybe he changes his mind at some point and comes back. And she says like, well, you got to say this is your home. And he says, no, this isn't my home, but this is my child.
This is my family.
And this is my family. And then he goes and puts Kizzy in the crib, and he says, your name means stay put, but it doesn't mean stay a slave. And then he starts to tell her the story of where he's from.
His father and mother and his culture. And... yeah,
as the camera pulls away from the candle inside the window. And I thought that was a really touching moment. And there's a bittersweetness to it because finally Kunta Kinte is deciding, I'm never going to try to run away again.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also recognizing that the struggle for freedom is a generational struggle. Mm-hmm. And even if he, at this point in his life, is not able to escape himself, as long as his culture can escape with someone, whether it's his daughter or a more distant relative that he's not ever going to meet, as long as those things can escape and be free, then he can be free again as well.
Yeah.
And it's powerful, but it's really tragic.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And that's where we...
Go ahead.
Thank you. That's where we leave episode 3 and the part of the story that primarily focuses on Kunta Kinte himself.
Yeah.
And so we jump forward into part 4.
There was one thing that we didn't talk about so far, and that's the characters of Genelva and Luther,
mm-hmm.
Who are characters on the Williams Reynolds plantation.
Yeah.
So Genelva is like a young woman who, in a really disgusting way, Dr. Reynolds is surveying the enslaved people that he received from his brother, and he's asking his right hand man. He's like, okay, what are all these people good for on my plantation? And the guy says of Genelva that she would be good for breeding. Yep. And then he says, okay, we'll find someone to breed with. And he flat out says, like, you can't be with Luther, who's this like older guy, because he's too old.
Mm-hmm.
And so then their plot is about she wants to be with him even though he's older. Then there's a scene where she like essentially fools Kunta Kinte into going to bed with her,
right,
so that everyone will think that she likes him now, and then that way she and Luther can run away together.
mm-hmm.
And kind of off screen, we learn that they were captured and sold off to separate places, and it just, I think, provides an important foil to the relationship of Kunta Kinte and Belle, where their relationship, again, like I said, it's an act of defiance and rebellion, but it's an act of defiance and rebellion that ultimately Reynolds is sort of willing to abide. But the act of like love and defiance and rebellion that Genelva and Luther engaged in, because he disapproved of it, he's able to swiftly and cruelly put it to an end. And so I think that does a lot to sort of create the dire atmosphere of like, even though Kunta Kinte and Belle have found this love and are together, it's tenuous just by the nature of the institution and the nature of the way that people carry it out.
Right. We're seeing
yeah.
it in comparison to another one that doesn't go the same way.
And so I think just structurally, as a piece of storytelling, it's a sort of good way to communicate those ideas that maybe happens further off screen than I would have liked, because it's sort of a blink and you miss it mention from Fiddler or maybe Kunta at one point. But I thought it was just important to bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. But for now, unless you have any stray notes, Magellan, I am going to say that we're going to take it to a brief musical break, and we'll be back to discuss part 4 of Roots. Hey folks, this is Alan, just coming in here to introduce the following quote from House of Representatives member John Robert Lewis, who unfortunately passed away on July 17th, 2020, since we recorded this episode due to pancreatic cancer. I'm not going to speak to his legacy myself. I'm going to let him do the talking. This is in particular a quote from his appearance on Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. on PBS, and that's all I have to say. Rest in power to John Lewis.
The vote is the most powerful instrument, most powerful nonviolent tool in a democratic society. A knowing that a member of my family registered and voted in Alabama 100 years before I did, before my mother, my father, my grandparents. It's amazing. So maybe, just maybe, it's part of my DNA, my bloodline, or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, who would have believed that your ancestors were one of the pioneering people who voted in the state of Alabama among the former slaves?
This is incredible. This is too much.
Welcome back to RootsChatz. The second episode we watched this week was Roots Part 4.
The Rootsening.
Hold on, the document's scrolling. I'm sorry, it's stuck. Okay, it was written for TV by James Lee and William Blinn. The two halves of it were written by those people separately. Directed by Marvin J. Chomsky. It originally aired January 26th, 1977. And Alan, let us know what happened in Part 4 of Roots.
You got it, pal. In this episode, by 1780, Kunta accepts his fate, settles down with Belle, and they have a daughter named Kizzy. Several years later, Kizzy befriends Anne, the young girl who was the result of a secret affair between Kizzy's master, Dr. William Reynolds, and the wife of his cuckold brother John, the previous Kunta's owner. The girls quickly and secretly become best friends, which ends up having unintended, serious consequences later on.
Where do we pull these summaries from?
IMDb.
Interesting. Very
I
interesting choice of words. IMDb.
Yeah, the word term cuckold has a different connotation now. Also, I think that these summaries are only the first half of the thing that we're watching. Because on IMDb they're separated. Yeah. They're separated into 8 parts on IMDb, so that's my goof, guys. But basically, the second half of Part 4 is an older Kizzy after being sold to a different owner, and she has a son named George, who's a chicken fighter, and she meets a man who seems to be comfortable being a slave, and they have conflict and interesting conversations. And then George goes off to be the new main chicken fighter for his owner, and we are going to follow him next time. So, yeah. What do you think? Kizzy's an interesting character, I think, because she is obviously taking the legacy of Kunta Kinte into the 19th century. I remembered this time, guys, that you add 1 to the century, the year to get the century. And like where America is at and where her sort of feelings about revolution are at. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this episode has, again, a few scenes that I think the first half I liked more than the second half.
Yeah.
Although there were parts in the second half that I also appreciated. I think this episode does a good job of sort of taking the mask off of William Reynolds and being like, no, this guy deeply is terrible.
Yeah.
And that was needed, I think. I really like Kizzy as a character.
Leslie Uggams, baby.
And the relationship between Kizzy and Missy Ann I thought was fascinating. There's a lot to unpack there. And I thought that was actually pretty well rendered. And then the second half, I was sort of like, all the Kizzy stuff I still thought was good. But then everything with Chicken George, I was like, I don't know about this. We'll see where this goes.
We might be not spinning our wheels necessarily, but just doing a different version of this plot line. But we'll see where that goes. I mentioned Leslie Uggams mostly because she's another like sort of stunt casty actress. She was actually in the Deadpool movies as Blind Al, as like his older friend and neighbor, which is fun. But weirdly, I know her because of her iconic hairstyle back in the 70s. She had this like high curl style, which they referenced on an episode of The Simpsons, because when Marge was in like summer camp as a kid, She said, "I want you guys to curl my hair so I can look like Leslie Uggams." And all of the white girls at her summer camp were like, "Who?" And she's like, "Uggams, Leslie Uggams." The whole joke is that she's just saying the name.
What a weird pull.
Yeah, seriously. I have no idea what episode that's from or if I made that up, but that's where we are. Yeah, and I think I also enjoyed Kizzy and her relationship to her parents.
Yeah.
And I've at least found it more engaging than her relationship with Sam, even though the Sam stuff feels like the sort of conversations that started happening and were happening, but now we're getting to zoom in on at this time.
Yeah, I think there's
about-
like a thing from the Sam plotline that I appreciated, and then the rest of it I could sort of take or leave it.
Yeah, and we find ourselves, like I said, in the 19th century, Magellan, which brings us to the eventually. Do you know when the Civil War sort of starts to heat up? Are we going to bump into that in this?
Yes, I know.
Hi, U.S. history teacher here. When's the Civil War start? No clue. Couldn't tell you.
Well, I mean, technically the conflict starts in 1861.
Oh.
The Roots, the original series, goes through to Reconstruction, from what I understand.
Oh,
So
fun.
We'll see that next week, yeah.
Then what else is going on in the 19th century? Anything?
The one main historical reference that I caught, so we flashed to 16 years later, and this has sort of been happening in the background in an interesting way, but William Reynolds is talking about how he wants to get one of those newfangled cotton gins, yeah, which is a device that was invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, and there's been reference to cotton so far. In part 2, I think, the other Reynolds brother is he's talking to Ames, and he's like, "Hey, I got this new plant. It's called cotton. I'm thinking of growing it. Let's just test it out in this like side field." And that guy's like, no, it's tobacco. It's always going to be tobacco. So we're seeing in not in real time, I guess, but we're seeing it happen that the plantation economy of the South is shifting from one cash crop to another, from tobacco to cotton. And cotton had already been grown to a certain extent, but the cotton gin, what the device does is it makes it a lot easier to remove the seeds from the actual, I guess you'd call it fabric, of the cotton plant. And so it made it a lot more efficient to produce cotton, which every time I teach this in my class, so there's a student who's like, well, wouldn't that mean that there's less demand for enslaved people because you can do the work of picking cotton faster? But it sort of has the opposite effect of, now that cotton is so efficient, it actually creates a huge worldwide market for cotton products, because it's like, oh, now we can actually manufacture with this plant on a massive scale. So we're going to see that, and we're going to see that the plantation agricultural economy really accelerate and grow pretty rapidly. I don't know how much we're going to witness that from the sort of ground level perspective that we have in Roots, but I guess that remains to be seen. But
right. Overall, what does the advancement of technology change about the structure of slave labor and slave labor people at the time?
And it deepens sectional division, because it makes slavery even more profitable and more widespread, which is going to lead to a lot of the problems between North and South that ultimately lead to the Civil War. The other interesting historical thing that's going to happen soon, actually happens between the first and the second half of this episode, is that the United States ends the importation of enslaved people in 1807, I think.
Whoa, really? So no more new people?
Yes. So the trade between Africa and the United States ends in the early 1800s, which again is one of those things where you might think like, oh, so that
awesome
means that's a good thing, right? That means that slavery is maybe lessening. But in actuality, the people for whom that's good are the plantation owners, who now have complete control
Oh.
over the flow of this form of property, these people, because now all trade in enslaved people has to happen domestically.
Oh, and they can like mess with the prices and
Yes.
oh, thinking about the
control
structure
over the market.
thinking about the structure, yeah, of a market economy when it comes to human. Oh, right, my brain's gonna bend in half.
I mean,
thinking
the
about
market revolution that happens in the early 1800s, as it's called,
Mhm.
you could also, I mean, it's also the first industrial revolution. It's all built around slavery and around the textile industry. So, like,
Yeah.
the real first birth of a capitalist market economy, as we can start to understand it today, is inextricably linked to slavery.
Thanks, America.
Yeah.
And Kizzy's growing up in this time. It's fascinating that we open with her speaking to her father, and she mentions that she's learning words in African, and he has this very like important little moment where he has to remind her that like Africa's the place, you're getting it mixed up. Africa's the place that you come from. It's not the language, which is hilarious and fascinating. Just like the way that like you were saying earlier with her son, like how the culture starts to get blurred even when it's being directly taught like by parents to their children. It's already within one generation getting like changed.
Yeah, there's this sort of just general sense of like Africanness as opposed to the specificity of Kunta being from the Gambia and specifically from his village of Jufere.
Mm-hmm.
And like, yeah, those specific details are kind of being ironed out as they get passed along.
And we have a new generation of kids falling in love on the plantation. We meet Nathan, who is kind of ends up taking on the
Noah, I thought.
Noah. You're right. I kept writing Nathan on my thing, and I was like, "That's such a weird name." It is Noah. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I read it once, and then I just kept writing it. But yeah, so Noah ends up being the Kunta Kinte to Kunta Kinte's fiddler, sort of. He kind of is like that the generations flip a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about how he wants to propose to Kizzy, and they want to do the broom hopping ceremony, which is their like marriage ceremony. And he loves her a lot, but he also has the mind of a enslaved person who wants to escape. Yeah. And so Kunta Kinte is very frustrated with him and doesn't want to talk to him. There's multiple scenes early on where he's like, "Can I talk to you?" And he's like, "If it's going to be about my daughter, I don't even want to hear it. If it's going to be about my daughter, then I have work to do." Basically. Mm-hmm. Do you want to help me do this work, or do you want to go away? But then the more important, so we have that, which is mainly to, it comes into effect when he does successfully, or initially successfully, escape. But Kizzy's plot herself is about her relationship with Missy Ann. Did that summary did mention her name, right?
Yeah, she's in the first half.
True. Yeah. But so she's called, but it's Ann Reynolds.
Yeah.
And yeah, because she's in the first half, she's the one who's like, "Can I get a cookie?" And then like Belle gives her a cookie and all that stuff.
Yeah, and they're talking about like, oh, it's, she seems like she's actually Dr. Reynolds' kid, and it's like, oh, that's just a rumor. But Kunta's like,
pretty sure I saw it.
Pretty sure I saw her being conceived, so it's
Yikes.
not a rumor.
So she is coming back, and she was Kizzy's best childhood friend, and her parents are telling her, white people change, just like you and I change. There's no one here. No one's going to say that she's going to be exactly the same person. She might not still be your friend. She might unfortunately be hella racist. Who could say?
Yeah. This, if the first episode was kind of about like love in slavery, this episode is really kind of about like enslaved people forming relationships with white people, and the dangers that come with that. Because Kizzy, when Missy Ann arrives, there's this moment where Kizzy runs to her, arms outstretched, like, "Oh my gosh, it's my best friend." And it's all just so, I don't know. It was really disturbing to me, honestly, this whole relationship between the two of them.
It quickly takes on the vibe of a horror movie. I mean, the moment when later when Kizzy's being sold to another plantation owner, and you see Missy Ann like looking through the window smiling. That's just as scary as any thriller horror movie I've ever seen. Like that's just straight up a nightmare.
Yeah, because she sort of like acts as if she's friends with Kizzy, but ultimately has no real attachment to her. She teaches her to read, like because she thinks it's funny, kind of.
Pretty much.
And that also kind of adds to the horror element of it, because there's the moment where she's reading from the book, and then William Reynolds busts into the room and is like, "Kizzy, were you reading?" And Missy Ann says, "Oh, no. We were going to pull this prank where we were pretending that she's able to read." And
he immediately is like, no. Like, Ann, it's not your fault. I'm not mad at you.
yeah.
Kizzy, why are you reading? Are you really so mean that you would really make a joke about my wife or whatever, that you would joke on her that you know how to read?
Yeah.
That's awful. I can't believe you thought to do that.
Yeah.
At this point, if you have any remaining sympathy for Dr. Reynolds, you need to throw it out the window.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole, like, it's an important thing to consider is that we forget that all of these enslaved people are, the vast majority of them are illiterate. And that's deliberately done so that they can't communicate with each other. They can't read literature, that they can't learn about the outside world. I mean, later on when Kizzy asks, like, I don't know, this is such a powerful moment too, where she's talking to Kunta Kinte and she says, I don't know where we're from. I don't know where we literally are right now in relationship to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And he tells her basically like, all that matters is that you are here now and you shouldn't go anywhere else. But he explains to her the concept of north, south, east, and west. And there's all that stuff too, which is, again, amazing. But we can get to that.
Well, and the other reason to not teach an enslaved person to read or write is demonstrated in the fact that when Noah runs away, when he's captured, he's found with a forged pass.
Yeah.
Which
she wrote because she knows how to write.
Yeah, which she wrote. Which was the moment that he was like, oh, we found him with this pass. I was like, oh, fuck. Oh,
yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, because and what also interested me about the plot was that not only are white people making sure that African Americans can't read, but also the moment that Kizzy demonstrates that she knows letters and she starts writing them on the bricks in the room with her parents, her mother slaps her across the face.
Yeah, it's intense.
Because, I'm sure in Belle's mind, it's like, I need to punish her and do this to her now, because if I don't, then whatever someone else is going to do to her is going to be so much worse than me, like, slapping her in the face and making sure that she doesn't continue to read and learn her letters. And it just made me think about, like, if we're trying to look at the story of slavery as a sort of as a case study that could be more broadly applied to forms of oppression across human history, the ways in which, like, oppression is carried out by the oppressors, but also, like, almost what's the word I'm looking for? Preemptively, sort of, what's the word? It's sort of preemptively, like, those who are oppressed are also carrying it out to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Because they
perpetuated. Yeah,
because they, like, obviously don't want to face the consequences imposed by those oppressors. And so there's a way in which what Belle does is both cruel and kind to a certain extent to her daughter. It's a really complicated moment because she's also trying to keep her daughter from reading, which is a path to freedom and fully realized humanity. But she's also trying to keep her daughter safe and alive. So I thought that was a really nuanced and complicated moment.
It makes me think, too, about stuff like the prison industrial complex, if we're, again, to try to zoom out to today, and the idea that if we don't let the people learn early on, then they can never advance enough that they would learn to be free or learn to, like, kind of match us in success or be any sort of form of successful.
Yeah.
Like if we can like cut that off at a young age, then there's no hope for them. So that's sort of like the core tragedy of her not being able to learn to read.
And you think of you saying that prison industrial complex. I mean, it made me think about like the ways in which Black parents, even in today's society, talk to their kids about like, you know, what are the things that you can say? What are the things that you should like avoid doing, you know, around a police officer or that sort of thing, where it's like, you know, the duty is I need to drill this into my kid's head and make sure that I like prevent them from doing something that's going to potentially get them killed. Even if in the moment they might feel like, Mom, you know, why are you doing this? You're like forcing me to act a certain way, or you're like limiting what I'm able to do. So it's not as if that complicated idea has gone away. Like it's still
absolutely
part of our society.
We even see later on, like we talked about this in the previous half, like the concept of code switching starts coming about, where like all of these people can speak to each other very with the full spectrum of their vocabulary, but they choose and they have to by necessity sort of like, I guess, dumb down their education a little bit, or make it seem like that to white people because it's like a safety method. It's a thing that keeps them alive.
Mm-hmm.
And
because it fits with white people's worldview. I mean, Missy Ann, when she's talking to Kizzy, she's like, well, things are just this way because like you were born less intelligent than me, and so this is how things are supposed to be. And so yeah, it's kind of to like keep a low profile because it's what white people are expecting.
Yeah, and we can get to that scene, but because basically the other stuff in this is lots of Kizzy just character development and learning that she talks a lot and talks to everyone and has a lot to say, which is great. There is a tragedy briefly here that the fact that Kunta talks to her about how her name, she's like talking about how what's the guy's Noah is trying to run, and he's like, I named you Kizzy because I want you to, like, it means don't run, even though he literally says at the end of the episode like it doesn't mean that exactly. It means don't stay a slave. Like he's already like not growing up out of that idea, but realizing that it's hard to teach that to someone as young as her. But anyways, she gets to hang out with Missy Ann, and they get in trouble with Dr. Reynolds. And eventually, Missy Ann has the real quote unquote brilliant idea that she's going to purchase Kizzy.
Or ask for her as a gift, I think.
Right, which and it seems like this is kind of the moment where the veil peels all the way back on her, and we see the full horror of her upbringing and her understanding of the world. Because at first they're having a like very equal conversation about like, you're gonna be in a room right next to mine, Kizzy, and no one's gonna hurt you, and I'll never be mean to you ever. And then she's like, yeah, but like things are different between the two of us because your people are worse than mine and all of this stuff. And Kizzy, feeling like they're on equal footing, says, but the abolitionists say that that's not true. They say that like we're allowed to be free and we should be able to. And she snaps. It's like watching a mask flip over, literally. And she says, if we weren't friends, Kizzy, I could have punished you for mentioning abolitionists.
Yeah.
As soon as you bring in that up, I'm no longer your friend. I'm your future owner. Because the idea of letting her be free is unconscionable, and shouldn't be thought about because that'll spread and it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
So.
And she spouts all this stuff about like the abolitionists are evil and they're going against God, and
the Quakers are going against God, which in modern context we're like, that's hilarious.
Yeah, and I don't know how much to really buy, whether or not people are sort of drinking their own Kool-Aid here, and I like Ames, for example, was a character last week who we could see that he was purely a pragmatist, or someone like the guy on the ship, Slater. Yeah. Ames and Slater both feel like they don't believe any of this shit, and they're just sort of doing what they're doing because they know kind of how the world works, and they know that they would be at the bottom of the totem pole if slavery didn't exist. And then you have people like the Reynolds brothers where, I don't know. Like, I do still think that they don't believe any of it. But when it comes to Missy Ann, it seems like maybe she buys some of it.
Yeah.
At least the part about the abolitionists. It's hard to tell, like, does she really believe that they're going against God? Does she really believe that this is God's order? Or is it also she believes that because it's convenient for her? And neither of those, like, excuse those ideas, obviously.
Exactly.
Because it should be apparent to any person with humanity and empathy that, like, you're literally looking at another human being. But I guess I'm just interested in how those ideas develop, because it's definitely an American invention, this notion of, like, it's God's way of things, because you see in the historical literature, in the late 1700s, someone like Thomas Jefferson, for example, he's never really saying about slavery like, oh, this is God's natural order, this is how things should be. He's always talking about slavery as, like, obviously this is a moral wrong, but what are you going to do about it? And then as you get into the 1800s, increasingly people in the South are not actually becoming more ashamed of slavery. They're more vehemently speaking about how slavery is actually not just like a moral bad, but you have to live with it, but it's morally good. And so as a historian, I'm curious about, like, did people believe that, or are they just kind of saying that shit to say it?
Right. And like, does modern white supremacy have roots in this sort of idea of, like, this is the way it's supposed to be? Like, why are we changing what we knew was right a long time ago, and the bad people made us change our minds, like all of that.
Definitely. Right.
There's a lot of modern context and modern connections to that idea.
Yeah. The other thing about Missy Ann is another casting thing. She's played by this woman who is like a Broadway and sitcom star.
Yeah.
And it's like, what is happening? It's like, I don't know.
I saw a credit in either this episode or the second half of this one, because for me these were split, where it was like Ian McShane, and I was like, what the fuck? Like, Ian McShane's in this too? He's actually not. He's in the Chicken George stuff, so we haven't really seen his character yet. But yeah. Anyway, so she talks about wanting to buy Kizzy, and then Noah. We're told from Kunta Kinte that, like, if Noah can escape and be escaped for a week, then he's basically free. We're to understand that means that he's far enough that he can get to the north safely. Yeah. And just as a week hits, he's brought back and is whipped horribly in the barn and captured again. And we just see the whole, like, the Kunta's family crying. Yeah. It's at this point that, once again, in case you really weren't sure, that Reynolds is just the most evil man. Even as Belle is pulling on his shirt, begging him, just crying her eyes out.
Yeah.
He's saying, I'm selling off Kizzy because she wrote the fake note for him, and that they need to be punished. And even as you start to see this moment where he's, like, kind of thinking about being empathetic, he kind of puts it out of his hands and says, she was already sold. Like, there's no point in you talking to me right now. Stop. Yeah. It's horrible. And then again, as they're like taking her away, and, like, the guy on the horse is, like, whipping Kunta Kinte and Belle. You see Missy Ann in the house on the top floor, just looking down like the most evil villain, scary gremlin witch person I've ever seen in my life. It's horrifying.
Yeah, there are multiple moments in this episode. The kind of lesson of the episode, which is what Kizzy says to her son George at the end, is like, hey, don't trust these white people.
Yeah.
Don't trust anything that they say.
Again, advice that parents give to their children today. Like, don't trust your white friends entirely, because you never know.
I think the lesson here is, like, unfortunately, when a person has to choose between mercy and power, they will choose power.
Right.
Because for Reynolds and Bell is like, I've worked for you for 40 years. I've been here for 40 years. Does that not mean anything? And he was like, you were doing your job. That doesn't get any
Doesn't
sympathy
count.
from me. Totally callous. And yeah, she's on her knees begging. And we see that happen a couple other times in the episode, actually, because later when Kizzy is with Sam, and then he like brings her by the Reynolds plantation to try to see her parents, and then he ends up bringing the carriage back to the new guy's plantation late. He blows up at Sam and threatens him in much the same way that we see this sort of mask off moment with Anne, where he's like, oh, this guy's fine. But the second that there's even a hint that the power of these white people is threatened, they will violently defend it without missing a beat. And I was really interested to see in these two parallel moments, Belle on her knees begging, and then Sam on his knees begging, and how that scene is as much about the people on their knees begging as it is about the person with them watching them do that, and this sort of like deep sorrow you must feel seeing the person that you love like completely lay down their dignity in front of this white person who then essentially spits in their face.
Yeah.
That's like so heartbreaking.
It's kind of hard for us to grasp because the idea of prostrating yourself before somebody else in modern American society is not, you don't see it very often at all, if at all. But in many other modern societies, and as well as like going all the way back in history, the idea of like bowing before someone and begging before them, and it goes back to way before the Bible. Like that's just a fundamental, like, I'm giving myself up to you, and I have no sort of like stake in it. Like not have no stake in this, but like I have no power here. I'm completely submitting to you. I remember a scene in I don't know if this is like weird to mention, but like in an anime I watched recently, a moment of like, not only am I saying sorry, but I am like submitting my entire moral self to you. One character bows like their head to the ground to another person, and it like prompts the person standing up to cry because they're like, you just basically told me like, that's it. Like I have nothing left. I'm giving it all to you. Like I have nothing. Yeah. So, it's important to recognize that like the idea of, like bowing to someone and begging them like that carries a lot of weight and should.
And it fundamentally changes both of those relationships, because after Kunta sees Belle beg, first of all, he tries to stop her from doing it. But then after he sees her do it, there's this real distance between them. He goes out and collects the dust from her footprints because it's a Mandinka belief that if you do that, then the person will return. And it's really, really sad to see after she's like completely lost, her dignity in this moment, in order to like reclaim it. She sneers at Kunta Kinte and like takes out her frustrations on him.
Right.
And also he doesn't like seek to recognize that or console her or empathize with how she's feeling. He just sort of accepts her rage and doesn't do anything about it. So there's like this real wide gulf that's placed between them because of both the loss of their daughter and because he's witness to this moment where she is like completely enslaved by Reynolds. And then later in the episode, when Kizzy witnesses Sam do the same thing, that's what breaks it for her. And she says, no, I can't be with you. Like, I can't be married to someone who would do that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And to get us there, because I want to dive into the sort of second half of this episode, but with Kizzy sold off to Tom Moore, who we're introduced to earlier in the episode briefly in a scene where he's like, all this plantation stuff, nonsense. Kanjin, who cares? I'm into fighting chickens. I love cockfighting, and I'm going to make a ton of money off it, and that's going to be my success. And they're like, all right, weirdo. Like, they're all drinking, they're drinking their beverages on the front porch. And he's just this like weird dude, but he comes back and he's the one who buys Kizzy. And in a horrifying scene that ends this half, he brings her back and says, I'm going to get my money's worth. And he rapes Kizzy. She tries to defend herself, is unsuccessful. And as she gets up either later that evening or the next day, she tells another one of the enslaved women, no matter what, as long in the time that I live, I'm going to get my revenge on that man. And so that's where we cut, and then we jump ahead several more years. Do you know exactly how many years
18,
it is here?
18 years.
18 years. So they got Leslie Uggam some like white hair makeup, and now she is the mother of a boy named George, who is way into...
I think they aged her up too much because she's only 34 at this point.
Well, yeah, I guess whenever I think like they aged them up too much, it's like, I'm sure, man, that much labor will make you look older, but it definitely like is a lot. Her son George is working with a man named Domingo with the cockfighting ring and all that stuff. And that's a sort of a side plot. It felt weird having an A and a B plot at the same time.
This episode really felt very sitcom-y, soap opera-y.
Yeah, yeah.
In a way that bugged me.
It's mostly conversation. There isn't actually that much like action, I guess, if you want to call it, in this episode. It's a lot of people
it's like meet cutes and, I don't know,
sex scenes and like sitting in bed and all that stuff.
And I can sort of understand. I don't know. I was conflicted about it because obviously you don't want Roots to be just like, here's a bunch of miserable, cruel stuff that happened to black people.
Yeah.
Because that sort of like torture porn, for the sake of a white audience being like, ooh, that's so bad, I'm glad we're not doing that anymore, is obviously not good. But then the danger on the other side is like, you don't want slavery to look quaint either.
Yeah.
So I was conflicted about this.
This is the show fully getting into that stuff. This is like the worst it is so far, where it just feels like everything is kind of nice. I actually took very few notes at this point, other than, again, really enjoying the performance of Sam Bennett. Richard Roundtree, motherfucking Shaft, is here, guys. And he's so handsome, and everybody talks about how good looking he is, even his owner, which is weird and bad. And he immediately starts flirting with Kizzy, and he's really, really aggressive with his flirting. Talking about, like, she literally goes into her room, and he's like, you're going to let me in, right? And she's like, no. And he's like, it's something about, like, pride. I'm pretty prideful, and you're not really giving me anything here. I'm giving you a lot, Kizzy. And then, like you said, they have this, like, meet cute moment where she opens the door, and she's like, so, you coming? And then they, like, have sex. And you're like, what? Like, yeah. Their relationship is really weird. George, I feel like, doesn't get a lot of development in this yet.
Yeah.
He's just kind of, yeah.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about Kizzy and Sam, and then we can, I think, end on George and like what we think about George.
Yeah.
The thing that I appreciated about the Kizzy and Sam plot, the scene that I liked the most, was they're together in her cabin, and he's like, do you have any water in here? And then she's like, yeah, I've got some. And then he says, okay, fetch me some. And she dumps it on his head.
Yeah.
Because she's like, hey, don't tell me to fetch things for you. Because
you should know better. We're told that by them.
Yeah. Like she says something like, I'm enslaved enough, out there, or the rest of my life. I don't need to be enslaved by you too. And it made textual something that has been kind of a running thing that's been on my mind throughout watching Roots so far, which is the intersectional nature of slavery. Because, we have to acknowledge that within slavery, misogyny and patriarchy also exists. and this sort of sense of entitlement that Sam has, and that even to a certain extent Kunta Kinte had.
Exactly, I was about to say that.
When he went to find Fanta, that's present here, and it doesn't diminish the horrors of slavery and that form of oppression, but both things are happening at once. And so I was really glad to see that portrayed here, and to see Kizzy so vehemently stand up in the face of that, and to see Sam be like, okay, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry, please please come to bed, please come kiss me. So I hope that they continue to do that, but I would at least appreciate it that there was a textual acknowledgement of the intersectional nature of slavery.
Right. I think that we will see the child of George at some point before the end of this, but right now we are looking at the woman between two male generations.
Yeah.
So a lot of the story of Roots is about young black men, and so we don't really get a lot of the story of like the black female experience until her thing, which but this is the value of it, right? Is we get to see that it's not just about being an enslaved person, it's about also being a woman.
And you have to wonder if there's also a gendered component to George's dismissal of what Kizzy says to him at the end of the episode.
Yeah. I definitely want to talk about that.
Yeah. So we can talk about George. Well, so what ends up with Kizzy and Sam, like we said,
it's really not that deep.
She essentially says, like, she essentially says to Sam that he is comfortable being enslaved.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't remember what she says, but like from your head to your toe,
yeah, you're
enslaved or something like that. And she just, because what the thing about the soul, is that when she talks to him?
She does mention the soul thing to him, yes.
Yeah, because she says like, yeah, I just didn't like seeing you do that, and he was like, well, I know that Tom Moore was here last night because when Tom Moore agrees to sell Kizzy off and be married to Sam, he comes back to her and he rapes her again. Mm-hmm. And Sam's like, well, I knew that he was here last night. And Kizzy's like, well, why didn't you say something? Why don't you care that happened to me? And he's like, well, it is what it is. And she basically says, well, that's the problem. Like, he can take my body and do what he does. That has nothing to do with my soul, my spirit.
He can't take that.
He can't take that from me. But you're giving them your spirit for free. Like, the fact that you don't give a shit that this happened to me. Where are you? You know,
where's your moral compass? Where do you lie?
Yeah.
If you don't, to be extremely corny, it's the Hamilton line. If you don't stand for nothing, what do you fall for?
Right.
But it's basically what she's saying. It's like, I can't be with somebody who doesn't have any sort of moral compass and would let horrible things happen for their own safety. That's awful.
Yeah. And
complacency is as evil as as committing those acts.
Yeah, and I think she's drawing an important difference between, like, she's not saying you should have come in and stopped it from happening, right?
Yeah.
Because she understands the consequences of him doing something like that. But what she's saying is, like, you need to care and you need to be outraged by this, and you need to want as badly as I do to find a way out. Even if it's not right now that we are able to find that should be what we're both hoping for. And he essentially walks away by being like, I have dreams too. They're just not as big as yours. And she's like, well, yeah, I hope your dreams come true.
All come true. Good job. Mine probably won't.
Yeah. Because ultimately her dream is to be free, and his dream is to be married, I guess. It's like
have
not
money.
Quite the same thing.
It's an interesting again, sort of like gender distinction, to sort of pivot a little bit to talk about both Sam and George and how they relate to each other, where the males in the society seem to have this understanding that if you acquire enough financial means and you hustle hard enough, then you can catch up and you don't have to be an enslaved person. You don't have to be struggling anymore.
Yeah.
I think that's especially true, obviously, with George, who basically, as he like kind of bumps into her plot as George is leaving, and this is where it even more so feels very sitcom-y, because he's going through the whole thing of like, he has this complicated relationship with his grandfather. He doesn't really seem to understand his legacy. People are like taking from him, like other enslaved people are like messing with him, and all of this stuff. But he's trying to he's pulling himself up by his bootstraps. He's discovered the quote unquote American dream, the American lie, right?
Yeah.
And he bumps into her as she's like weeping at Sam leaving, and he goes, "Oh, I thought you were gonna get married to that guy." And she's like, "It didn't work out." And he's like, "That's weird. Anyways, Mom, I'm gonna become rich and free myself." And she's like, "You're crazy. Like, why are you saying that?" And he's like, "It's gonna work." And she's like, "All right, honestly, you are my son." Like, yeah, I respect.
Yeah, and she actually she's on board with it. At first, I thought she was gonna be sort of disillusioned with. Because, like what you're saying, it definitely very closely mimics the sort of like, I'm going to get rich and famous and get out of here and then come back for everybody, like that kind of thing, which the sort of, I don't know, maybe this is crass to say, but it's sort of like the hoop dreams mentality of like, this is my path. I'm going to get enough money this way and then I'll be free. And I think we have a lot of cynicism about that in our society today because capitalism cannot liberate you from oppression because it is capitalism that is the oppressive force. But at first she's sort of like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. And the thing that bothers her is she's like, just don't trust what Moore says. And he's like, what? Come on. He's great. I love that guy. And then he like runs off and clicks his heels he's like, he's like a father to me, which dramatic
He's a
irony.
nice owner.
Dramatic
Or he's
irony.
a father to me. Right.
He is his father.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just the haunting thing is that George has a camaraderie with Thomas More because of cockfighting. This sort of like very male, it's literally called cockfighting, but this very male thing, pastime, is what is bonding them together, sort of over the head of his mom.
He's thinking Moore doesn't talk about like whipping and slavery and hurting me and making me do labor because we talk about making money together, which means he likes me. And it's like, no, your boss doesn't like you. He's using you to make money for himself, ultimately. And that's even more so something that you see in today's society, the idea that you were saying, that you can buy your way out, and that lie that we are told under capitalism, that like the best way to liberate yourself is to earn the money to do it. And so I'm really, really fascinated again by that and where George's career is going to take him, because the little bit that I understand is that it like kind of works, but then ultimately doesn't. Like it starts in the classic Roots fashion, the classic historical fashion. It like he has a simulacrum of freedom and then is quickly realizing that it's not anything.
Yeah. And it's really upsetting to see Kunta Kinte's his
grandson.
Well, his philosophy be kind of lost, in this generational transfer. Yeah. Where George is sort of like, nah, I don't really care about that stuff. That's not really my path. And it's tragic.
Yeah, because it feels like Kizzy directly wants to bring all of the ideas that her father imparted upon her directly to her children. But when she talks to George and it's like, please, like, hold that revolution in your heart and hold the desire to be free and don't forget about that. He takes that and says, okay, hell yeah, you got it, Mom, for sure. I'm going to make a lot of money and I'm going to be so famous. And it's like, oh, you're so close.
Yeah.
You're so close. So that is where we're going to be going as we conclude Roots next week. John, is that accurate?
That's accurate, yeah.
If you could do me a favor, could you not read the summaries for next episode from Amazon, please? because
because they might spoil it. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, exactly. Well, at least for the podcast, because I can't stop you from spoiling yourself. But I want to see where this ends for people watching along with us. Thank you, and also, yeah, we're gonna just go all the way to the end of Roots next time. So.
Oh yeah, I definitely won't read these.
Yeah. Thanks, pal.
The one thing that we didn't talk about from the second half is Kizzy visiting Kunta Kinte's grave.
Excellent scene. Love it.
Yeah, what did you think of that?
She scratches out his name where it says Toby and writes Kunta Kinte in big letters. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's pretty don't forget. And I kept thinking about because the show has kind of put me in the mindset of oh wait, how is this going to go wrong? How is this going to go horribly wrong? Yeah. And I was like, no, I think actually with Fiddler dying, it is sad that he is dead, obviously, but he's free. There's nothing that can be done to him anymore. Now he gets to die as Kunta Kinte and not as this name that was given to him. Yeah. So it's this sort of this posthumous triumph that unfortunately is one of the only forms of freedom that a lot of them are able to get.
Yeah. That scene, if I remember correctly, is not in the book.
Really?
Yeah, it's added for the miniseries.
I fell hard asleep during this section of the episode, so thank you for clearing that. Were there any other scenes in this part that I need to see or remember? I felt bad because I was taking notes, and I think I was only actually out for 5 minutes, but I went to bed. I closed my eyes as she was talking to Sam, and then I got and after the him begging the man scene, and then I got up and she was writing Kunta Kinte on her father's grave, and I was like, well, I hope I didn't miss anything big. Please don't embarrass me.
No, you got everything.
Okay, great, awesome. Sometimes I take these accidental micro naps. It's fine. But yeah, that's basically what we got. Again, Roots is continuing to be really interesting and full of richness and lessons for us to take. But it's also kind of messy and sad and frustrating in interesting ways. So with that, I think we should take it to the plug zone, Magellan, if you're okay with it.
Okay, let's do it.
If you would like to comment, send us comments. If you'd like to email us, please do so by heading to chatspod@gmail.com and sending over emails. We also have a Twitter @chatspod. That's all spelled CHATZPOD. We have a subreddit called reddit.com/r/chatspod where we have fans and listeners, talking, chat in the community, listening to old episodes of Chat. It's fun. You rate us wherever you listen to podcasts, and please consider supporting us if you can, although we do always recommend, especially now more than ever, supporting Black Lives Matter and Black voices across the world over us. And we have our own Patreon. If you want to help us keep the lights on here, it's patreon.com/chatspod. We have just a couple monthly goals or monthly tiers that you can join at and support us and get all sorts of bonus content. We actually piloted Roots over there on our Pilot Chats show, so you can hear that and our introduction to the series. So we have that going on, and we encourage you to check it out. And finally, we have these things called Chatsims, where instead of personal plugs, we recommend people things to do, see, watch, play, etc. Magellan, can you start with your Chatsim for this week?
I have 2.5 Chatsims for you.
Whoa.
It's really 2 wholehearted and then 1 half-hearted Chatsum.
It's a Chats.
So first, I've got 2 podcasts. One is the wholehearted, one is the half-hearted one. I want to plug here a good friend of mine from college, Arthur, who he was a year below me. He was in a lot of the comedy stuff that I did there. He's just a hilarious guy, and he just wrapped up doing a film school, and he met a couple other people at film school who have started a rewatch podcast together. They're all screenwriters, and they're all together watching Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And the show is called Full Metal Analyst, which is it's cute. It's good.
I like it.
And it's nice. Their episodes are tight. They're like 30-minute episodes, and they have a lot of good things to say about Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. I've never seen it before. Arthur had been trying to get me to watch it for years and years. And finally, I guess the thing it took is he had to start a podcast in order for me to do it. So I'd recommend that. My half-hearted podcast recommendation is another TV-related podcast. It's The Darkest Timeline, which is hosted by Joel McHale and Ken Jeong from Community. And it's not a rewatch podcast. They first talk about COVID for the first 30 or 45 minutes because Ken Jeong was a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And then they talk about community stuff and other questions in the back half. But I'm recommending it for people who like Community and like them. Like me, I just watched through all of Community, and I'm trying to fill the void with anything that I can. So it's nice to hear them and to hear some people from Community come on and answer questions and stuff. But it's a half-hearted recommendation because it's kind of messy and they repeat themselves a lot. And also their sense of humor is to just be really mean to each other, which I don't like. So take it with a grain of salt. And then my other recommendation is for a film that just came out on Hulu.
Ooh.
Called Palm Springs. And it is fantastic. I loved it.
Wow.
It's already one of my favorite unconventional rom-coms. I don't know, rom-coms where the premise is fantastical in some way. Basically, it's what if Groundhog Day was set in a more sort of beachy, deserty looking place, and instead of just one person going through the time loop, it was both of them going through the time loop together.
Ooh.
And it's very, very funny and touching and good.
And it's Andy Samberg and Kristen Milioti.
Kristen Milioti. I'll watch Kristen Milioti and everything. I think she's fantastic. And Andy Samberg is always very charming. So
wow. That's a high recommendation. Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of good press about that one, so it's good to hear it's actually a good time.
J.K. Simmons is in it too.
Oh, is he in the loop? That would be telling.
Do you want me to spoil that for you?
No. You tell me off pod.
Well, here's a quick spoiler. Cover your ears, everybody. He's in the loop, and he's like a villain.
Oh.
Yeah, isn't that good?
Yeah.
Smart. Yeah, so
love it.
I recommend it. What about you? What's your Chatsum?
As I mentioned last episode, one of the things I want to focus on with my Chatsims for Roots is things, whether they be shows or movies or whatever, that kind of focus on the history and culture of different nations that the rest of pop culture doesn't focus on. And so for this time, I'm talking about I found it all on YouTube. I don't know if it was broadcast on television, but it's a series called History of Africa. The full name is History of Africa with Zainab Badawi. And basically here's the sort of elevator pitch from the BBC News themselves. This series of 20 programs is based on a unique project overseen by UNESCO known as the GHA, the General History of Africa. Africa's history, culture, and heritage written and told by Africans themselves. Zainab Badawi travels across more than 30 countries in the West, East, Central, and Southern Africa and explores the continent's history from the beginning of time to the modern era with the goal to, quote, set history straight. She captures key moments in their history in her conversations with Africans from all walks of life, including leading historians from across Africa, and she brings alive some of the lesser-known heroes and heroines of the continent's past. I watched the first episode of this and was really floored not only by the production, but by the sort of amount of research and work that was done to give African people a voice and be able to talk about their own history, because it seems like common sense, but what better way to learn about a nation's history or a continent's history than from its own people? Weird idea. So yeah, definitely check that out if you have a lot of time to sit and watch YouTube stuff like I do now. It's called History of Africa, and it's from the BBC News Africa YouTube channel. And that, dear listener, is going to do it for another do it for? That's going to do it for this episode of RootsChatz. Thank you to Magellan for being the rock to my hard place, and thank you for listening to this episode of RootsChatz. Peace.